Hello, all you wonderful people out there in the dark. Thank you again for checking in. Very good wine, by the way, from Monterey. Highly recommend it. So today, I wanted to talk a little bit about science fiction books, and I guess specifically authors to some degree. And I was thinking about it the other day, and before we get moving along too fast, I think, at least in my puny brain, there's two kinds of science fiction. There's how's the best way to do it? Think of it like there's two types of movies, I suppose. There's the 2001 Space Odyssey science fiction, which is grounded, I suppose, in more science and more reality, if you will, at least short-term reality and science as we sort of know it. And then there's the Star Wars and Star Trek science fiction, which is much more fantastical, much more fantasy-laden. I certainly side more with the fantasy-laden. I'm a Star Wars guy. I'm a Star Trek guy. Right? How can you beat this? But there's a tremendous number of books that were written that predicted things that actually ended up coming true. And some of them, there was a great deal of time before they came true, but they came true nonetheless. And like I was just saying, you've got 2001 Space Odyssey, and at that time grounded somewhat in rational science, whereas clearly this is much more fantasy-based than anything else. But who's to say that in hundreds of years this won't become more of a reality? But anyway, so 1818, this lady named Mary Shelley, well, she writes a book called The Modern Prometheus. It's better known today as Frankenstein. And she actually predicted, as you all know, you probably haven't read the book necessarily, but you've certainly seen the myriad of movies based on her novel. But she basically predicted organ transplants in 1818. And it would be well over 100 years before any of that stuff was even attempted. And today, organ transplants, I wouldn't go so far as to call them commonplace, but they're certainly common. 1865, probably the father of modern science fiction as we know it, Jules Verne. He writes a book called From the Earth to the Moon. And what he's basically in that book, he describes the Americans landing on the moon 104 years before we actually did it. 104 years, which again sort of reinforces what I'm talking about. What seems silly today, maybe in 100 years won't seem quite so silly. Probably will, but you never know. So anyway, From the Earth to the Moon, the book, the capsule is called the Columbiad. 3 guys are shot from a rocket heading to the moon. In the book, they actually use a telescope to track the progress. Now, a couple of interesting things. We did send 3 guys in a capsule in 1969. Only 2 landed on the moon. And the name of the command module was the Columbia. Not the Columbiad, but the Columbia. I'm sure it was named directly in honor of Mr. Verne. And we actually used a telescope that could see 200,000 miles away. When Apollo 13 had its accident in 1970, we used that telescope to be able to view the accident, not the literal accident, but as the thing was spinning, we could use a telescope and kind of see what was going on. And coincidentally, both in the book and in reality, both capsules left from Florida. And that was in 1865, so 104 years passed before some of what he sort of predicted in a fictional account actually happened. In 1870, Mr. Verne again, he writes 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Great. Sea. Great novel, great movie. The Nautilus is an electric-powered submarine. It wasn't until 1888, about 18 years later, that the French had a sub that would run on batteries and electricity. The same year, in 1870, Mr. Verne, he wrote a short story called The Year 2889. Actually, I think he wrote that in 1889. But he predicted that news would be read to us each morning. Now, obviously, 2889, it only took probably, another 30 or 40 years for the radio to be invented, and news was read to us, not just in the morning, but all day long. And then along came television, etc., etc. So he predicted that in 1889. So 1887, this cat named Edward Bellamy, he writes a book called Looking Backwards. And this is the very first mention of a credit card that people would use to pay for items. He talked about a world where you would have complete interactions where you wouldn't speak or have any interaction with an actual person. You would go to a box, you'd order something, pay with this credit card, and it would magically appear in a box later that day or the next day for you to pick up, or maybe you arrive at your house. Does that sound familiar? Is that not Amazon? Is that not Uber Eats? And a myriad of other things, all the food that can be delivered to your home. And he wrote Looking Backwards in 1887. But, he was off by 130 or 40 years, but here we are. 1911, this cat named Hugo Gernsback wrote a novel called 124C41 Plus, which I think is sort of a play. If you say it slowly, it'd be 12C or 124C41 Plus. I'm not sure. It's a really stupid title. But in 1911, he was the first to predict a video phone, which we all have in our pocket today. Every iPhone with the you got the camera where you can talk to each other. He also predicted air conditioning, television, solar energy, tape recordings, and radar. Long before Mr. Clark predicted any of that stuff, which in 2001. Obviously, in 2001, we kind of see the first remnants of what could be considered an iPad, and credit cards are certainly used in that movie. I think he makes a call down to earth and uses a credit card of sorts, which certainly existed in 1968, but not the way they do today, obviously. But Hugo Gernsback, 124C41 Plus, video phones, air conditioning, radar. There was another novel written in 1911. It was called Tom Swift and His Electric Rifle. It's by a cat named Victor Appleton. And I mention it, I think it was a series of books that were written for young kids or young boys, sort of adventure books. Tom Swift. There's a number of novels that involve Mr. Swift. Well, this cat in the 70s named Jack Cover, he invented the taser. And we all know what the taser is. It's the thing, shoots those electrodes and tries to immobilize, I guess, bad people, if you will. And he invented it at that time because there seemed to be an uptick in people trying to hijack planes. And obviously you can't fire a gun off in a plane. It tends to defeat the purpose of stopping a hijack. You start blowing holes in a plane when it's in the air. So he invented the taser. And no one really thinks about this, because I know you didn't, but the taser is Tom Swift Electric Rifle. Now he added the A, so it would be Tom A. Swift Electric Rifle. It's the acronym, taser. Isn't that interesting? And he did it, yes, he did it on purpose, and he acknowledges he added the A, because you got to have an A just so it made some sense. But I thought that was really, really cool. Now, in 1931, Huxley's Brave New World, we're all familiar with that book. But it featured, it was one of the first novels that featured mind-altering drugs. I think it was called Soma in the novel. Now, 20 years later, the government, the Food and Drug Administration began looking into mind-altering drugs. And another, 20 or 40 years later, 2008, they approved the use of Prozac for depression. And it's the third most prescribed drug in the country, probably the world. Mr. Huxley also predicted and talked about genetic engineering in 1931. So predictions sometimes come true. Also, 1931, this cat named Neil Jones, he wrote a book called the Jameson Satellite. Now, what this book is about, the main character, basically he dies and he orders everybody to send his body into space because of the basically zero temperature that it was in space would preserve his body because he wanted to be brought back to life. Now, in the book, it takes like 40 million years for anybody to figure out how to regenerate a body, and he gets brought back, and whatever the creatures that are inhabiting the planet at that time revive him. Now, that book from 1931, Mr. Jones's book, inspired this cat named Robert Edinger. Now, Bobby, he read this book as a boy, and he ended up inventing the Cryogenic Institute, where he himself and his two wives are frozen, along with a bunch of other hoopleheads that think that at some point they're going to be able to regenerate their bodies. Now, what fascinates me, those of you who know me know I've never been married, but I don't understand why you would freeze both wives. This would be your opportunity, I would think, to pick your favorite of the two. Why would you want to keep two of them on ice on the off chance that what you believe is true, that you can be regenerated? But I thought that was very, very interesting. In 1931, a book written about that would inspire a guy to actually create the Cryogenic Institute. 1933, another famous science fiction writer, H.G. Wells, he writes a book called The Shape of Things to Come. And a lot of people talk about how he predicted World War II and the raids on Berlin. I think that's a bit of a stretch because in 1933, we've obviously already gone through World War I and have watched the Germans a couple times in history try to take over the world. Obviously, World War I when they sacked Rome, although I guess they weren't really Germans at the time. But it doesn't matter. But I think that's a less sci-fi, more all you got to do is watch the news, read the news, or have the news read to you. 1948, obviously very, very famous. You guys have all already thought about it. George Orwell's book, 1984. He predicted Big Brother is watching. And obviously today, I'm pretty sure on every single street corner in America and probably the industrialized world, there is a CCTV camera, closed caption TV camera watching us. Even China now has cameras, and they have like a social rating system or scores that kind of like a credit score. How you act in public, how you communicate online gives you certain scores that may or may not allow you to get credit or allow you to rent an apartment based on the nonsense that you might post on Facebook or YouTube or any other social media platform. Or they watch you on the street. Do you pick up that trash? Do you throw trash on the ground? What kind of person are you? All Orwell essentially predicted. Now, 1950, one of my most favorite guys in the whole world, or authors anyway, Ray Bradbury. He writes a short story called The Pedestrian. And he's the first guy and he's the first guy to predict self-driving cars. 1950. Now, a lot of others, it all gets muddled and blended. iRobot, Osmonimus certainly talks about that. It's even in Total Recall. It's even in the movie based off the book, Schwarzenegger's Recall. I forget, it's called like a Johnny Cab, I think, and it's got a silly robot. But at the time, it wasn't meant to be silly. It just appears silly today. But that first concept of a self-driving automobile, thank you, Mr. Bradbury, 1950, the short story, The Pedestrian. It's worth a read. So, again, I'll call him my friend. I've met him several times, and he signed several of my books. But Mr. Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. He talks about earbuds. I think he called them seashell buds, but they were not headphones, little tiny buds that would fit into your ear and would play music. You could be talked to, information could be gathered. So he was the first to mention those. And also in that book, they had digital walls, which sounds a lot like Facebook, or for those of you that are Back to the Future guys and Back to the Future 2, they had the digital wall that would give you information about you. I think it also inspired Philip K. Dick, The Minority Report. That book got turned into a Tom Cruise movie where I forget there's parts where Tom Cruise is walking around and all of the ads are geared towards him as he walks through and what he likes and doesn't like. Or it's geared towards everybody, but we're only paying attention to Mr. Cruise. Does that sound familiar? Every time you go to Google, it knows exactly what you looked at, just moments before, and says, hey, I noticed you were looking for tires. You want more tires? Here's tires. But anyway, Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451, he predicts earbuds, and we'll call it a digital wall, basically the dawn of Facebook and those concepts. 1960s, Star Trek, the Communicator, very, very famous. We all love, Kirk Enterprise. That inspired a guy working at Motorola. In 1973, he invented the first mobile phone. His name was Martin Cooper. He saw Star Trek as a young man. It inspired him. He ended up, or he might have been working for Motorola, I don't honestly know. But 1973, the first mobile phone. In 1983, the first cell phone. And then in 1989, the first flip phone. He got really, really close to that communicator on Star Trek. I thought it was kind of cool. So 1969, this guy named John Brunner, he writes a book called Stand on Zanzibar. Now, in this book, he basically talks about, in 1968, basically there was enough, the population of the world meant that everybody in the world could all stand shoulder to shoulder on the Isle of Wight. And in this book, Zanzibar, Stand on Zanzibar, he predicted in 2010 there'd be 7 billion people, and because of that, you couldn't all stand on the Isle of Wight. They'd all have to stand on the island of Zanzibar, which is off the Tanzania coast, I think. He was off a little bit. We didn't hit 7 billion people on this rock until 2011. But he also predicted an uptick by 2010, an uptick in domestic terrorism in the United States. He called it violence in elementary schools and middle schools. I think school shootings is probably what we would attribute to today. He predicted that China would become America's #1 rival. He thought that alternate lifestyles would become, I don't want to say the norm, but would be much more accepted than they were in 1969 when he wrote his novel. And obviously, We've come a long way from that standpoint in 1969 being more accepting of how people live their lives. And the one interesting thing is he also predicted that the president, his name would be Obama. And I thought that was pretty interesting. He missed it by a couple of letters. Don't know that those are really sci-fi, hey, look, my ray gun, and in 30 years we invent a ray gun. But I thought it was sort of worth mentioning. And of course, in 1969, Douglas Adams, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It's kind of the first novel that you could sort of link Kindle or ebooks, and certainly the iPad to, though I think the iPad goes to Mr. Clarke in 2001 Space Odyssey, maybe even as far back to Star Trek with Bones and his, holding the light and reading the thing. But anyway, I thought that was super, super interesting. And I read a tremendous number of books. I'm probably half nonfiction, half fiction, and I do lend, when I do read fiction, I do lean more towards science fiction than I do murder, mystery, or other things. But hopefully you spend a little bit of time reading something. I highly recommend going back and forth between nonfiction and fiction. I think you'll find it's very, very interesting. It'll lead you down some interesting rabbit holes. But I thought it was kind of fun just to talk about how science fiction novels of the past have impacted us today, or what, and make sure your kids read them, because it might inspire them, much like Mr. Eddington, to create something from some book he or she has read. And how amazing is that? Even though, that's wackadoodle what he did, it's still amazing that he was that committed to it, at least to me. Anyway, I hope you had a good time listening to me rant about some old science fiction books. I have not read all of these. I've read the Wells, obviously Jules Verne, obviously Bradbury, Mary Shelley, but there's a few of these that I need to dig into. I may have to read the Zanzibar just to see what it's all about. But anyway, in this world, when you could be anything you want to be, you be kind, you be humble, you be forgiving, and you be melting snow. And please, go get a book, get a Kindle, go to your local library. You know what? I even have a library card. Hang on one second. My Nerd Platinum card. I actually have a library card for Riverside County, and I'm a middle-aged man. Now, I hardly use it because I have a Kindle. You can download stuff for free, but the amazing thing is, besides checking out a physical book, a lot of the libraries now have things that you can download onto your iPad or your Kindle or various other electronic devices. Please read something. Anyway, have a great afternoon. Take care. Bye-bye.
All weapons to full power.